Welcome back to Coast Vue. I really apologize for the bad quality of the conversation with Jeff. As I pointed out, he was at the Zurich Classic in the media room, where I'm sure the Wi-Fi there is just being, used intensively. Then on top of that, you had noise in the background, and what Kyle and I have learned, when you've got noise in the background, what happens is in Skype, which we use Skype, it tends to compete. The microphones end up sort of competing with one another. And I looked at Kyle during the conversation, because he and I can see each other, and he's just shaking his head. He's shaking his head. I'm like, this is not good. But we you could hear it enough to really appreciate that the Zurich Classic is a really special tournament for this region, not just New Orleans. And some of the best golfers in the world are there, and they're really enjoying being in the Gulf region. That's for sure. I'm excited now. Let me bring my next guest on in, and then I'll tell you a little bit about him and about this partnership that we formed with Rob. But before we go any further, I want to bring Rob Sigler, my friend, who works for Cruising the Coast. Actually, has a wonderful media background, and we'll get into that in a second. But Rob, welcome to Coast Vue, my friend.
Thanks, Ricky. I appreciate you having me. I'm looking forward to being part of the SuperTalk team, so to speak, and look forward to talking to you in the future as well as today.
Rob has a wonderful, wonderful history in newspapers in the state, and we'll break it down here in just a second. But as I have said on a number of occasions over the past couple of weeks, Rob is now a contributing columnist. We call him a thought leader. And because he's a terrific writer, he's worked in Laurel and Oxford and Picayune and Meridian and Vicksburg, and now he's on the coast. He grew up on the coast in Orange Grove. So he's got a really good statewide perspective. What he will be writing about is not just issues related to coastal Mississippi, but sort of, the social condition as it relates to the state. So it could be a wide variety of issues. In this particular case, it's about gun violence in Mississippi, the first column that he wrote. And we'll come back to that here in just a second. But I wanted you to get to know Rob better. And you can see his column, incidentally, at the SuperTalk.fm online site for SuperTalk Mississippi News, SuperTalk.fm, and go to news and then opinion, and you'll find his column there. We'll actually attach a link to his column to go along with this conversation we're about to have here in just a second. But we've got a growing number of contributors that are contributing. We've got a great news team at SuperTalk Mississippi News. And as I've said many times, the opportunity we have through these shows to make news, to talk to news makers, both on this show and shows that are regional across the state, and then through the statewide shows. When someone important in this state has something they want to say, they usually come to SuperTalk first. And when you combine that with the news effort and the news network, which goes beyond the 26 radio stations that are owned by SuperTalk Mississippi Media into 51 radio stations total, this is a very powerful news network. And as I said in my conversation with the owner of SuperTalk, Steve Davenport, it's a unique arrangement, one of the most unique, probably the most unique arrangement of collection of radio stations in the United States, because what's happening is radio stations are going to sort of the central location, and they don't have local anymore. But Steve's doubled down on local, and Rob's now part of that effort. Rob, so you grew up in Orange Grove, but tell about your path that brought you ultimately to Cruising the Coast.
Well, like you said, I grew up in Orange Grove, went to Harrison Central, graduated in '83. So I'm, fixing to have a 40th class reunion here in a few weeks. And grew up in, like you said, in Orange Grove, and went to Harrison Central. And my path in Harrison Central, I always knew I wanted to be a journalist. When I was 17 years old, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. And so I went to Delta State, went after finishing at Delta State, went on to my first newspaper gig was actually in Lynette, Alabama, of all places, and spent a year in Lynette and had an opportunity to get back closer to the coast. And an opportunity came up in Picayune, and I worked at the Picayune Item for 15 years, actually, and was there when Katrina hit in '05. And I was actually supposed to interview for a job in Laurel as the managing editor the weekend that Katrina hit. That August 29th, we were supposed to have a meeting on that Monday. Needless to say, we didn't have that meeting, and took another month and a half before I actually went up to Laurel to be the managing editor, and spent 8 years there in Laurel, and had an opportunity to go to Oxford, and spent almost 2 years in Oxford, and then went to Vicksburg and kind of wrapped up my 30-year career in print journalism as the managing editor there at the Vicksburg Post, and decided I want to get back closer to the coast. And my mom and dad are still alive with us. Fortunately, I'm blessed to say that, and want to be back closer to them. And decided to move back to the coast in 2019. And opportunity here at Cruising the Coast was available. And my family's been part of Cruising the Coast for more than a decade, probably 15, 20 years, part of Cruising the Coast as participants. And so now I'm the assistant registration director here. So I'm enjoying every minute of it. It's a lot. Cruising is what it is. It's a big event and a lot of work to do and all of that. But it's nothing like that daily grind of print journalism deadline. You know what I'm talking about, where it's just constant, nonstop deadlines, commitment for. Like I did it for 30 years as a sports editor and a managing editor, and enjoyed it. I loved it. Missed doing it at times, and still kind of dabble in it a little bit, with special publications, write a feature every once in a while for a few of those newspapers I used to work for and their magazines. But for the most part, I've retired from print journalism. So I'm looking forward to being part of the SuperTalk. Really appreciated when y'all reached out to me and had this opportunity to contribute in some form, because it allows me to still continue to voice my opinions and columns and interests and all of that through the SuperTalk network. So I'm looking forward to doing more of that.
Yeah, I'm excited about you being part of it, because again, with your background and having been really all over the state. Mm-hmm. And you and I were talking before we started that it's really remarkable, actually, that our paths didn't cross along the way, given that we've had, as you mentioned, Laurel and Oxford and Vicksburg and Picayune and I've knew publishers and owners from all those different newspapers, worked with many of them at the Mississippi Press Association board over a bunch of years, and even some of them on the board for the Southern Newspaper Publishers Association that I was active in for a number of years. So it was really interesting that our paths didn't cross in that way. But you retired out of the business in 2019. I retired from the business in 2016. But boy, during the time that during our careers from beginning to end, we saw massive change brought about by the digital tsunami, didn't we?
It still amazes me how much it changed in just a brief. I say, 30 years may seem like a long time, but when I started in 1989, we were still running copy through waxers and rolling it up before, printers and laptops became available and digital cameras became available, so we saw the tail end of that era, and then we're part of the digital era. And now it's just, I don't even know what to think of what print journalism is today, because I could still do some of it, but it's all done, electronically, basically, is what you have these days. And it's changed tremendously over the last 30 years. It amazes me still now how much it's changed, and it's still evolving to today. So, but I think local journalism is something that is vital to a community. I still believe that. And I believe that, people will get their news one way or the other, whether it's on their laptop or desktop, or the old traditional way of just reading the paper. And I miss that, Ricky. I know you probably missed reading that.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Sundays, so, but,
well, the business model
changed.
Yeah, the business model for newspapers, the revenue source for newspapers was literally obliterated.
Right.
The high cost of buying an ad in a newspaper was completely and mostly replaced. I wouldn't say completely, but mostly replaced by digital advertising. And, radio, as I've learned being a part of SuperTalk Mississippi News, Mississippi Media, radio's held their own. I'm surprised how well it's held its own. And Steve Davenport, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, has been very strategically focused on connecting to Mississippi in the way that he has. And it's, again, some media, TV, they've all had to go through change. They've all had to embrace digital. but none have had to deal with it more than newspapers, because the printed newspaper was gone. I was lucky, Rob, because early in my career I was actually an operations director. I got involved in installing new presses and saw Macs come along, and the whole digitization of the production process, and as we went to a total electronic approach in that way. That actually benefited me greatly further in my career as we got deep into how technology was going to change our world. And I'll always look back on it as a really interesting turning point in my career. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Rob Sigler, who is a new contributing columnist for SuperTalk Mississippi Media News, and he works for the Cruising the Coast team, which is a really important event here in coastal Mississippi. We'll see you after this break. Welcome back to Coast Vue. I have my friend Rob Sigler, who works at Cruising the Coast. What a great event that is for coastal Mississippi, a pinnacle event. But he spent a career in newspapers across Mississippi, and now he's a contributing columnist. We call them thought leaders for SuperTalk Mississippi News, and he recently wrote a column about gun violence, and we're gonna get into that here in just a second. Hey, just one of the important point I want to make, and that is that you made the point that local news and journalism is so important. I think back when I left the Sun Herald in 2009. Actually, let's look at 2005. Katrina hits. The smartphone didn't come along to 2007.
Right.
That's
right.
It's mind-boggling to think about it in that way.
Yeah.
And then look how it's revolutionized the world. But when I left the Sun Herald in 2009. There were between 50 and 60 employees just in the newsroom. There aren't that many employees at the Sun Herald now.
Right.
And in the newsroom, there may be 5. I don't know exactly. Next time I talk to Blake, I'll have to ask him, how many total newsroom employees they have. But when you obliterate the revenue model that pays for the journalism, then you're left with trying to do the best you can with what revenue you have. And in every community in America, newspapers had more resources, more news gathering resources than usually all the other media combined.
Right.
So boy, what that means to our local communities in terms of newspapers having a role in keeping democracy viable, literally having a role in keeping democracy viable, what that means to local communities across the United States is not good. And I think what SuperTalk Mississippi News is doing is filling that gap in the way that they can. And by adding more and more contributing columnists from across the state, people like you, Rob, I think we're going to be having really some important conversations about the kind of things we ought to be talking about. Now, what you wrote about is gun violence. So why don't you kind of give sort of the summary of what you wrote about?
Well, basically, you and I have had conversations in the past about the issues of gun violence and how it's increased. Seems like a lot over the last few years, particularly down here on the coast. And so basically, I was looking at issues where it seems younger people have access to guns and are doing harm to one another, as well as to the communities with their actions, and how it seems like those actions haven't had a lot of consequences, to be quite honest with you, or they have not tried to curb those issues. And you and I have discussed why those issues have evolved to where they are now, and I think a lot of it has to do that, in my opinion, how the family unit has devolved down to where you don't have the structure that the children necessarily need when they're younger. By the time they're teenagers, where this gun violence has developed, they're beyond trying to convince that they need to go another path. So the column itself was basically about how we've lost the sanctity of life in a lot of our communities, and down here on the coast is no different than what it is in New York or Chicago or LA or any of that. And so I think we need to try to find solutions to those problems. Mentorship is something that I really believe in. to try to get some of these troubled. Using the word troubled youth is kind of cliche-ish, I think, but there are a lot of youth in our community who are on the wrong path, and they seem to be turning to guns more and more. Since I wrote my column a month ago, a lot has happened. Down here, even here on the coast. If you look back over this past weekend, and it's gotten worse, Ricky. And I think the community has to get more involved in trying to find solutions. I don't think there's one magic pill that's going to solve this. And I think it takes a community effort from everyone: business leaders, church individuals, teachers, coaches, people that these youth look up to for guidance, and besides just their families. And so it's going to take an effort from everyone if we're going to try to continue to be a destination for tourism, for a place where we all want to live and raise our families and all of that. Because gun violence may not impact people directly, but it impacts all of us indirectly in some way or another. Whether that means, going out and feeling safe in our homes at night, locking our doors at night, walking our neighborhoods at night. Those are issues that affects everyone, and I think something needs to be done, and we need to try to find solutions to that problem. And it seems
Rob, it's interesting because it's almost like it wasn't by design that this happened, but here we are for 3 days in a row. Now, this is the point I want to make. 3 days in a row. Wednesday, I had a conversation with Paige Roberts, who is the CEO of the Jackson County Chamber, about a column she wrote about teen suicide, and Tiffany Murdoch, who is the CEO of Singing River Health System. So we had this terrific conversation, important conversation. I can't say, talking about teen suicides was terrific, but the reality was these are two very passionate women who are engaged in the community to try to find how can we begin to take steps to address teen suicide. And the process of having that conversation, though, it was hard to avoid the conversation around gun violence. And, sometimes the gun is aimed at someone else, and sometimes the gun is aimed at themselves.
Right.
It's a sad reality of where we are. And then yesterday, I have an hour-long conversation with Mayor Fofo Gillich about this past weekend and the culture of gun violence, and how the point is that guns and drugs and alcohol do not mix.
Right.
And then when you add to it sort of this culture of violence, it's a very, very complicated problem. And then, of course, you wrote your column some 2 or 3 weeks ago, and the reality of it is that we're all talking about it. We're being hit by it from so many different angles. You and I talked about this before we went on the air, but you think about the sort of the breakdown of the traditional family and not having a mother and father in the home, what that means.
Yes.
The issue of gun violence that is depicted in video games today, and the overwhelming science that's out there around what's happening to young people's brains when they're involved in violent games. And then you add to that, other role models not existing, and maybe the role models that exist are the ones you don't want them to have, and they're learning from it. I often talk about the long conversations I had with Mayor Mitch Landry when I was in New Orleans, and he said a lot of the young men that are involved in really, really violent crimes, some murderers, they will tell you the story that they are just scared to death trying to get through today. They don't expect to live through today, incidentally.
Right.
And so they make decisions based on that. And when you add it all up, it gets complicated. And what ends up happening when you get into a complicated social problem like this, people tend to bail out because it's just they just give up, throw their arms up and whatever. And we can't do that, man. We've got to figure out what the low-hanging fruit is, and we've got to figure out what the long solutions are going to be. But we have to give our law enforcement some help. I think about this past weekend, and I think one of the most compelling cases for action is how we put so many of them in harm's way, what was supposed to be a fun event.
Right.
And it becomes this violent thing where someone's killed, a cop is shot, other people are shot. They said shell casings were everywhere, all over the place. We've got a problem, and we've got to address it.
I live in Edgewater Park, right there next to Edgewater Mall. And my wife and I did not venture out throughout the weekend. We waited until Sunday afternoon to drive to Walmart, which is like a block away from our house. And we went at 5 in the afternoon when we thought things had calmed down. We expect, the inconvenience of what these type of events, entail. And so we expect that, and we deal with it, and our neighbors deal with it. But we ventured to Walmart that Sunday afternoon and spent an hour in there. And at 6 o'clock, walked out the doors and saw the traffic that had backed up on Switzer, Eisenhower, down Walmart Avenue, just because of that incident that had happened. And it took us half an hour to get home from Walmart back to our neighborhood. And so, yeah, you're going to expect those things. But, like you said, the gun violence aspect of it is something that we cannot have. We just can't. I mean, at any event, regardless of what it is, we just cannot have that type of behavior where people are put in harm's way, law enforcement as well as the people trying to have a good time. And I'm all in favor of people having a good time. I love that they come down and want to spend time and their money down here on our beaches. And, I think that's a great thing for our community. But, we just cannot have the aspect of where people turn to guns for whatever reason. So.
Rob, what was interesting, my daughter, you talked about, how long it took you to get back from to your house, which is just a matter of a few blocks,
right.
Over 30 minutes to do that. My daughter lives less than 10 minutes from my house, and it took them well over an hour to get to our house Sunday for dinner.
Right.
When we come back on the other side, we'll talk about how coastal Mississippi, in that moment, the clock stopped, man. I mean, everything about this community across coastal Mississippi, it just kind of came to a screeching halt from I-10 all the way down to Highway 90 and many points in between. When we continue our conversation about gun violence, about a column that Rob Sigler wrote for SuperTalk Mississippi News. We'll see you after this. Welcome back to Coast Vue. I have my friend Rob Sigler, who works, actually, his day job is with Cruising the Coast, one of the most pinnacle important events for coastal Mississippi. It's screamingly successful, better every year than the year before. It's been incredible. Even during the pandemic, I was amazed at how well it did. My friend Woody Bailey, who I've known for so many years, his inspiration of that effort and so many community leaders and what they've done there is terrific. And in fact, I actually think it creates a bit of a best practice about how, when you have a single promoter and have, they're following all of the proper steps that are checking in with municipal governments and coordinating with the municipal governments and has one sort of single message, and et cetera, how an event can go off. In the case of the event from this past weekend with spring break, I watched one of the promoters that was involved in the Coliseum, and he said he'd been involved in promoting for 13 years without any incident. And it's very possible that we crop all of the promoters into one sort of bucket when there could be a reputable, and probably is a reputable promoter within the group. And the other promoters that don't really care much about coastal Mississippi or the rule of law and how what they're doing enables all these pop-up parties to occur, and then social media spreads. And, that's how you get into a situation when you've got all these sort of organic things that happen. And that's what happened this past weekend. And then you had these unfortunate bad elements that come to town. Anyone who will stand in the middle of Highway 90 and fire a gun into a crowd, they don't care much about human life. And we got to be smart about how we deal with this going forward, like other communities all across Florida. Now, look, if you want to read more about that, I wrote a column about it at the Coast Vue Ricky Matthews page, and then you can go watch my full hour-long conversation with Fofo Gillich at SuperTalk Mississippi News, your favorite podcast, where you'll find it in anything related to SuperTalk on Coast Vue, on Facebook or YouTube, et cetera. We're talking with Rob Sigler, though, about his column about gun violence. And, as I mentioned when we went to break, for that moment when that gun went off and you had policemen coming from every direction and going north and south on Pops Ferry Road Bridge, I can see that from my house. At one point, I did a video of 5 police cars speeding across Pops Ferry headed north. Man, when you got gridlock already that you described, and then you have an event like that happen, and man, God forbid if anyone were to need emergency services during that moment, we were shut down, and for a good long time, Rob. And that can't happen.
That's scary. That's a scary thing that can happen right there when you have that kind of chaos all at once, where you have people basically fleeing for their lives. And you've got law enforcement trying to get to where the incident's taking place. It's just a recipe for disaster. And it was I applaud law enforcement for the way that they handled themselves and the incident that took place this past weekend. They had their hands full Sunday afternoon, and they had their hands full all weekend, but especially Sunday evening whenever that incident happened there on 90. And I feel for them because they have this very tough job. And Chief John Miller with the Biloxi Police Department does a tremendous job for keeping Biloxi safe. And my heart goes out to him and his officers for the what they had to deal with this past Sunday evening, especially.
Yeah, one of the things that Fofo Gillich mentioned on my show yesterday was that he had already heard from Billy Hughes, and they had a conversation. And then Leonard Papania, the CAO for the city of Gulfport, former chief of police for Gulfport, was engaged in that conversation as well. I urge all coastal leaders, all mayors, boards of supervisors to take a one coast approach, because one of the really compelling statements that was made by Chief Miller at the city council meeting is that he had talked to Florida mayor of Miami among them, incidentally, who actually reached out to him, to Chief Miller, not the mayor, the police chief from Miami. But what they said, they feel sorry for Biloxi because they were coordinating their efforts to put this to bed, and they knew that this group would find the weak spots, and that Biloxi was going to be a weak spot. And they said, and they say Biloxi, they really mean coastal Mississippi. Right. What they said was they only regret that they didn't call us and let us know that. And so we got it. What will happen is if Biloxi puts stringent guidelines in place and Gulfport doesn't, they'll find the weak spot in Gulfport. Or if Gulfport and Biloxi do it and they find a weak spot in Bay St. Louis or Pascrest Dam, they're going to find that as well, like they did in coastal Alabama, like they've done all across Florida's coast. We need a sort of a coordinated approach to this so that they know that we welcome people to coastal Mississippi, but we're going to do everything in our power to assure that people have safe visits to coastal Mississippi. And this past weekend was anything but safe. One of the things that the police chief said was that usually they'll be not lucky. That's absolutely the wrong way to describe this, but they might have one assault on an officer during an event. It's rare to have that. They've charged 7 people with aggravated assault, and then could have been as many as 12 with people throwing bottles at police officers or pushing a car up against them. Just a difficult situation. Yeah. Anyway, Rob, we're out of time. It's been a pleasure to spend time with you, my friend. Thanks for being part of our family as one of the thought leaders for coastal Mississippi and the state for SuperTalk Mississippi News. We look forward to reading future columns and talking to you about them right here on Coast Vue. See you, my friend.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you on Monday.